Hi everyone. I want to talk a bit about the 39th President of the United States, the late Jimmy Carter, who has sadly passed away at the age of 100. The only American president to become a centenarian so far. That's quite a milestone. Um, Before I get into that, it's worth looking a little bit at 2024. This is New Year's Eve, so last day of the year, and this has been a year that's seen a number of world leaders pass away. So off the top of my head, and I may be omitting some people here unintentionally. In Chile, Sebastian Pinera, who died, I believe, in a light aircraft crash. In Ireland, the former Taoiseach John Bruton, who was known for his reconciliatory tones with the United Kingdom, having a good working relationship with John Major. Um, in Canada, former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, who was Prime Minister when I was born. Um, in Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, who of course died in somewhat mysterious circumstances, and again in I think it was a helicopter crash in his case. Um, and recently in India, Manmohan Singh, the first Sikh Prime Minister of that country, widely acclaimed for spurning India's economic rise in recent years. So pretty significant figure, Manmohan Singh. Um, and there's probably others that I'm mitigating. But Jimmy Carter, former American president, the 39th president. Um, Let me just say a few disclaimers here. This is not going to be an exhaustive analysis, so I'm not really going to just skim the surface with some of my own personal thoughts on his legacy and on him. Um, and also, I freely admit that I do have a little bit of a bias. I always liked Jimmy Carter. Um, However, I think that in all honesty, as much as he's widely admired, I don't think he'll ever go down as one of the great presidents. Um, I think it's possible to look at Jimmy Carter as a great man, not necessarily a great president. I mean, realistically, we can't say he had an outstanding presidency. It was about average. It wasn't a bad presidency, but it wasn't a hugely successful presidency. And I think even his strongest supporters would have to be honest about that. It wasn't. He didn't get re-election, and he had some really difficult issues to deal with. But I think it is fair to say that Jimmy Carter had one of the most successful, possibly the most successful post-presidency. Um, and this was a man who really did achieve a huge amount in a century. Um, as did his late wife, the First Lady Rosalind Carter. She too was a great humanitarian. The Carters deserve all the admiration they get. Um, I think he's certainly one of the most likable individuals that has ever entered the White House. And someone pointed out something earlier that I hadn't really thought about. Of all the accolades that Carter gets and all the eulogies that are coming through, one that's very significant is that unlike a lot of other former presidents, Carter chose not to be on corporate boards. He chose not to go under the very lucrative after speaking tours. He is quite an accomplished writer. He's published several books, and I'm sure there would have been royalties from that. Um, and he was quite a wealthy man, I've seen a figure of presidential wealth, and Carter actually, not to start off, but in his lifetime, he became quite a wealthy man. But he also gave so much back. Um, I mean, no one could look at Jimmy Carter and say that wasn't a life well lived. Um, During this presidency, there was the issue of inflation. There was deep economic problems in America. The economy wasn't great on his watch. But he did think ahead of his time. Installing solar panels in the White House, for example, was quite forward thinking. Um, you know, Long before Al Gore ran for the White House. And there were other things that I think Carter deserves credit for. He was definitely progressive on racial issues, on civil rights. He was a Southern president. I believe the first Southerner since Reconstruction. Um, No, no, I've got that wrong. Lyndon Johnson, of course, was a Texan. Um, but there was something about him being a Southerner that was notable. I think it's certainly the first Southerner to be elected in the post-civil rights era. That's something. Um, Carter, even during his campaign in 1976, had a few minor controversies, which are very, very small fry compared to some of the stuff we've seen in recent years. For example, he gave an interview in Playboy, which some evangelicals didn't like because Carter is quite a pious man, a devout man. Um, but he justified that by saying it was a way of reaching out to America by saying, look, I'm a normal guy. Of course, I think of attractive women, and yet Jimmy Carter, and Rosalind Carter had the longest presidential marriage. Unlike some other notable Democrats, Jimmy Carter was never a womanizer. He was never, he never had that sort of sleaze attached to him. Um, even his biggest critics would have to concede that he was just a grounded individual. It's very hard, I think, to pin any major sleaze or scandal on Jimmy Carter. The worst they could say about him is perhaps that he was out of his depth or that he had a lackluster presidency. But there are now things that have emerged in recent years that certainly would warrant a bit of a reevaluation of the Carter presidency. For example, it's widely known that the hostages in Iran, which was a major embarrassment for the United States at the time under Carter, um, they were released on the very day that Reagan was inaugurated. In fact, very hour. Now, there is some credible evidence that suggests that the Reagan administration, in a very cynical way, negotiated with the Iranians behind the scenes to release the hostages at that time, at that precise moment, to make Reagan look good in exchange for various diplomatic overtures. Now, if that's true, it was a very cynical move by Reagan to basically use those hostages as political pawns. And I say that cautiously, but um, it's possible. Reagan was a populist. It's possible. Um, and by contrast, it made Carter look weak on the issue. I think in retrospect, that's unfair. Um, I think any incumbent in the White House at the time would have had a real difficulty when dealing with Tehran. Um, the film Argo shows the events around that well. Um, you know, Jimmy Carter wasn't perfect. I'm sure people could point to things that happened in his presidency that would warrant some scrutiny. But I think if you look at a man's legacy and if you look at Jimmy Carter as a peacemaker, that's a very strong testament. And the Camp David Accord, signed in 1978, I believe, between Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, um, with Carter as a mediator, that really is a towering testament to the man. To this day, even with all the tensions in the Middle East, Egypt and Israel haven't exchanged a shot in anger in over 40 years. Now, that to me is a very strong testament to Jimmy Carter, which is why any assessment of his presidency should at least look at him in a favourable light in that sense. Um, so no one can say that that wasn't an achievement because it was. Um, his post-presidency work is astounding. The work that the Carter Center has done on promoting democracy, on human rights, um, is a huge testament to both Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter, and the Carter family and Carter insiders. I've got a book actually, right? I'm just looking at it right now. Palestine Peace Not Apartheid. This was written by Jimmy Carter in the 2000s, and it shows the insight of a man who's not only an experienced statesman, but someone who genuinely cares about that part of the world. Like I say, Carter was a very devout man. He was a man of faith, and he deeply cared about both the Israelis and the Palestinians. Um, I imagine that headline would aggravate a lot of right wing Israelis or Israel supporters, but actually, Carter very much stresses Israeli security in the book, and I urge anyone to read this. It's very well written. It's not massively long, I mean, I haven't completed it yet, but this is coming from someone who had real world experience in that situation. I do think it's a little bit sad that Carter's final, year. I don't know how sort of conscious he was of the news because he was a very old man, but it's kind of sad to think that, if he was aware of this, I'd imagine it would have given him a lot of sadness to know what's going on there today. Um, and it would be interesting to see what his stance on that would be. Um, Carter, I think, opposed the Iraq War, if I've got that right, or at least he expressed disquiet about it. So, and he also stood out as being the sole Democrat um, between two Republican administrations. Um, in fact, pre-Republican administrations you had Nixon, Ford, and then Carter, and then Reagan. So, a little bit like Grover Cleveland in the 19th century, Carter was kind of squeezed in there as the sole Democrat for a generation. Um, I think history will look kindly on Jimmy Carter. His presidency will not go down as a great presidency if we're being honest, but I think that people will look on him kindly. Um, Former presidents have all made tributes, including the president elect, who said that we had a political differences, but he credited Carter. The same thing can't be said of some of his supporters. Who cannot help themselves. They were actually coming on to tributes to Jimmy Carter from the White House and from other sources, and laughing emojis. I mean, to me it says the mentality of a lot of Trump supporters. Despicable, but in the northeast of England, we have memories of Jimmy Carter because in 1977 he made a visit to the region, and I hadn't actually realised this before. I was aware of that visit, but I hadn't realised it was actually because Carter had ancestry in this region. I think Carter's an English name. But he visited Newcastle with British Prime Minister at the time, James Callaghan, and very welcoming crowds. And he kind of quit. I'm very grateful to be a Geordie now because the Lord Mayor of Newcastle had said, "Mr. President, you are Georgian. Today you become a Geordie." And it's a fond memory, I think, for people in the Northeast. He had very warm greetings. Muhammad Ali came to the region the same year, I believe. So, it was a big year for the Northeast. Um, we've only ever had one other president come to this region, which was George W. Bush in 2005, and he did not get the same welcome as Jimmy Carter did. Let me put it that way. Um, I'm going to wrap this up soon, but there's a great tribute song online by Michael Tomlinson, who I assume is a Georgian. He had a great song, I came across it a few years ago, simply called Seeds of Love, and it's just kind of a tribute to Jimmy Carter and his very humble origins and plains. um, it's a wonderful song, and I'll link it underneath this video. But you know, this is a passing of an era in a sense because Jimmy Carter outlived two of his successors, Reagan and Bush Senior. Um, so now every living president is were presidents within my lifetime. Clinton's the earliest now. So we have Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And the interesting thing is, of all the living presidents, the oldest is actually the incumbent Joe Biden, who's 82. That's a full 18 years younger than Carter. Um, just one last quick thing. On Boardroom, the business website Boardroom, they had this thing about presidential ages, and they said that the average age is 72 of a presidential lifetime. But that doesn't take into account the fact that people generally are living longer in the Western world in developed countries. And presidents, say, have world-class physicians around them. So I wouldn't at all be surprised if it kind of becomes normal for presidents to live into their 80s and 90s. I mean, recent years, every president has. Ronald Reagan was 93, Gerald Ford was 93, George H.W. Bush was 94. I remember when Bill Clinton gave a eulogy to Richard Nixon, he spoke about this as a man in his ninth decade. Nixon was 81, and Clinton spoke almost as if that was a remarkable thing. Nowadays it's normal. Incidentally, Bill Clinton was in hospital recently with some problems. He has had a history of heart problems. But anyway, I don't think it's going to be surprising if presidents generally live into their 90s now. But, for 100 years, that's incredible. It's never happened before for a president. Some other American politicians last year, Henry Kissinger died at the age of 101, I believe. Um, so, longevity, this is a presidential first. So, um, there'll be, I understand, a state funeral on the 9th of January. So that'll be a big thing. But yeah, sad news. History will treat Jimmy Carter well. Um, if not as a president, certainly as a humanitarian. And there's been a lot of criticism made of the Nobel Peace Prize, but I think in the case of Jimmy Carter, it was very well warranted. That was the right decision. Um, I mean, this is a man who dedicated his life to human rights, and you can't say more for a person than that. And you can't say more for someone than being a peace bringer. You know, um, anyone who tries to navigate the Middle East, any leader who tries to navigate that will see how complex it is. But Jimmy Carter did achieve something there, and that's a rare thing in the region. Um, so to me, that's his legacy, that and human rights. And if there's any criticism to be made of Carter, I suppose you could say it's a normalization of relations with China. So retrospectively, that might have been a serious mistake. America's recognition of the People's Republic of China, which by definition meant not recognizing Taiwan. So perhaps Taiwanese might not look so strongly on Jimmy Carter, but it is important to judge leaders in the context of the time. It's important to remember that when Jimmy Carter was in office, there was a Chinese president, paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping, who, whilst he was a de facto dictator, did look at the world in a very different way from Chairman Mao. So I think it's important to look at leaders in that context. Were Carter president today, I don't think he'd be that reconciliatory towards China. I think he recognised the human rights issues that are there. Um, that's my instinct. Um, I'm sure there's more to say. Check out that song if you can. Try to think if there's anything else I can add. I got a letter from the Carter Center years ago. Can't remember what the issue was, but I'd written to them. The response wasn't from the president himself, but it was from the Carter Center. If I ever visit the United States again, visited with my family back in 1999. If I ever visit again, I'd love to go to every presidential museum. That to me would be very interesting. Um, yeah, rest in peace, Jimmy Carter. Great man.